Tonight, we are talking specifically about opioid and heroin abuse, and it goes to the issue of substance abuse that has taken a hold in this country and in this world. But I have never seen anything like what we have been experiencing with opioid abuse. It discriminates against no one. If you think that the only problem with substance abuse in Glen Rock exists in our high school, you are absolutely wrong. In the last 4 years, Glen Rock has had a total of 16 heroin overdoses. 5 of them were fatal, and they involved individuals between the ages of 22 and 57. The youngest was a 22-year-old Glen Rock volunteer firefighter. The oldest was a 57-year-old retired police officer born and raised in Glen Rock. We have had 10 Narcan saves in the last 4 years. Each of the individuals who were saved by our officers were between the ages of 24 and 57. A number of them were repeat Narcan saves. Of the 15 defendants who have active drug cases pending before the Glen Rock Municipal Court, 15 of them have died of heroin overdoses before their case even came to court. There are 2 phrases you are going to hear tonight that are the basis of our program. One is we are not going to arrest our way out of the problem, and the other is if I had only known. Part of that approach has to do with awareness. We don't want people to be able to say, if I had only known. We want people to know that the problem is out there and there are resources to help you and your family members and your friends.
If you look at studies that talk about opioid abusers, 3/4 of them, 3 out of 4, have started with prescription opioids. And if you look at heroin use, 80%, according to the studies that we've looked at, started by misusing some form of prescription opioid. Someone had a legitimate sports injury, and they were prescribed too much, and they had opioids lying around the house, and they happened to like them, and the addiction kicks off from there. You had a medical community that was sort of pushing them. You had pharmaceutical companies that were marketing them aggressively. You had a lot of studies out there saying that they were safe to use, and there was no real science behind those studies, and it just sort of avalanched from there. The difference now is that the heroin that's out there, the drugs that are out there are just so much more powerful that the addiction is so much stronger, the deaths that we're seeing are so much greater in this country. And along with that, so did the deaths. And today, in 2016, they're estimating 64,000 drug-related deaths. So that's really the difference between what we're seeing today and the drug use we've seen in the past. All those other drugs that I talked about, the marijuana, the LSD, that's always been there. And it's ruined lives, but it's not killing the same way the drugs today are killing. And I think that's a distinction that we need to drive home, because the heroin of the 80s and of the 70s is completely different from the heroin that we're seeing today. The last year, for which we have full statistics in New Jersey, we had 1,600 or so, 1,587 drug-related deaths throughout the state. 98 of those, 85 of those in 2015 happened in Bergen County. In 2016, we had 98. And so far this year, as I mentioned, we are up to 106, and the year's not even done. Despite all of our efforts, is that we now have to contend with synthetic opioids, like fentanyl and carfentanil. So what's shown on this screen is a fatal dose of heroin compared to a fatal dose of fentanyl and a fatal dose of carfentanil. Fentanyl is 50 times to 100 times more powerful than heroin. And then carfentanil is about 50 times to 100 times more powerful than fentanyl. Heroin is very expensive to bring into this country. You have to smuggle it in. There's all sorts of middle people, whether it's a human smuggler, whether it's you're paying someone to bring it on a truck. There's always the risk of it being interdicted by law enforcement. Fentanyl is coming through the mail from overseas. right? Because they're able to substitute a cheaper synthetic with the heroin. But the problem is, because it's so powerful and because you have drug dealers who are not scientists, trained to be handling materials so dangerous, sometimes they're putting too much fentanyl in it. Sometimes they're deliberately putting too much fentanyl in a particular bag of heroin because they want an overdose. They want somebody to die because that's going to bring them more customers when the word gets out that their drugs are that much stronger than the other drug dealers' drugs. So this is what we're contending with. So what are we doing about it? Dean talked about this earlier. Traditional law enforcement responses do not work. You cannot arrest a disease. You cannot arrest a disease. So what we're doing is three things: prevention, treatment, and enforcement, but in a creative way, in a constructive way. Prevention is the key. I think the only surefire way to put a dent in this crisis is just to stop kids before they get to that point. Just to bring the message home, to raise awareness. So as a prosecutor's office, we have 110 detectives. Every Friday, 4 of our detectives from our narcotics squad are in schools in this county. 2 detectives go in the morning to do the school presentation, 2 go in the afternoon. We have a lot of help. We have people who are in recovery with us. We have people, parents of individuals in recovery with us, just to drive home that message that these are the paths to addiction, and once you get on that path, it's too late. It's just too hard to beat this addiction once you get to that point. Last year, in 2016-2017 school year, we hit 40 schools, over 13,000 students. We did 9 community groups after hours presentations like this one. And we talked to 9th graders, to freshmen. And I'm really starting to rethink that because I think we have to go in even earlier. Because by the 9th grade, we might have missed them. But this is a prosecutor's office doing this. We need buy-in and we need help from parents to encourage their teachers and their school principals to really take the lead here. We're taking the lead here and we don't mind doing that, but it's got to be a part of the curriculum now to talk about heroin and opioid abuse in a really meaningful way. But we're filling that gap. On the treatment piece, since we're running a little bit long, I'll skip through this. One of the things we're doing is we have walk-in hours. We have a HART program, the Heroin Addiction Recovery Team, at 3 police stations so far, Mahwah, Lyndhurst, and Paramus. Anyone suffering from the disease of addiction can come in, turn in paraphernalia, clear warrants, and get lined up for treatment. We started that in April, and so far we've had about 50 or 60 people go through that program and get into some form of treatment. Another thing we do is a recovery specialist program. This is a program where when there is a Narcan stake, and one of Dean's guys revives somebody using Narcan, and they're brought to Valley Hospital, they also call up to the Public Safety Operations Center in Mahwah and tell them we need a recovery specialist because we just revived somebody and they're being brought to Valley Hospital. So this is a program that we seated at the prosecutor's office, and we have 13 recovery specialists who are on call 24/7, who will then go to that emergency room to try to have a conversation with the individual who's been revived, whose life's been saved, or with a family member to try to get that person to treatment. Because what happens is, once somebody's revived, they go to a hospital, they're otherwise medically cleared, there's no mechanism to keep them there or to get them into treatment. And what we see too often is they'll go, leave that hospital or ER setting in the state they're in, and then use again, and that might be the fatal overdose. Enforcement. So we have, like I said, 110 detectives. We arrest people. That's what we have to do. We're a law enforcement agency. We have to arrest people to send a message of deterrence that we're watching. We have to arrest people to get information about who's stealing the drugs, how much they're being sold for, what particular brands of drugs are being sold, if there's something particularly powerful out there, just for the traditional law enforcement reasons. But what we're doing is we're being a little bit smarter. That for those individuals who are suffering and are low-level drug offenders, we're offering them treatment. So our detectives will bring somebody back to our offices in Paramus, and when they're processed, we call it Operation Helping Hand, we'll have a recovery specialist, we'll have a social worker, we'll have a clinician in our office ready to talk to that individual to say, hey, we have an option for you at Bergen Regional, down Newbridge, a detox bed, or if you need intensive outpatient, or if you you need inpatient treatment. We have beds lined up for you through these relationships, that collaboration I talked about. Take the time now to introduce you to Kyle and Kathy. And they've spoken with us at some of our school presentations, and I've had the fortune of meeting them actually in Glen Rock not too long ago, and so I want to welcome them up here and ask them to share their stories with you.
I'm, excuse me, Kathy Boomhauer, and I'm here to share something that 8 years ago I would have been absolutely mortified to stand up here and tell you, but I am the mother of a heroin addict. Thankfully, he is a heroin addict in recovery, and I consider myself very blessed because I'm lucky enough to have him here in this room today. We have met so many people who don't know where their children are, or even more devastating, have had to bury their sons and daughters. It's just heartbreaking. They say that addiction is a family disease. There's a quote that I had read that said, addiction is not a spectator sport. Eventually the whole family gets to play. And my family got to play. I lost my father to addiction. Last year I lost my oldest brother to addiction. And I have several family members that are struggling with the battle right now. But when addiction came after our son Kyle, our beautiful oldest child, our whole lives changed. He had a typical suburban life. He grew up in Paramus. He had a lot of friends. He did well in school, played sports. But we noticed as high school progressed, and we kept what we thought was a great eye on him and talked, and we had a great relationship. But we noticed as we got towards the end of high school that Kyle had changed. And our compassionate, intelligent, athletic son, he just became disengaged from life, lost interest in his family, so many changes. He was lying, he was stealing, he was skipping school. I'll let him tell his story, but he gave up college scholarships, all for an addiction that had spun out of control. Our lives had become completely unmanageable. But yet through it all, I kept trying to fix everything, because that's what we parents and enablers, that's what we do. And first of all, I didn't want anybody to know, but I just wanted him to go to school and have a normal life and graduate. And we all just got sucked right in on his journey with him. I became a great detective. I could check his Easy Pass, I checked his phone. The day I searched his car, I found his first arrest record, which was devastating as a parent. And then later came to find, by picking up the mail one day, that my poor younger son had missed a letter from attorney about a second arrest. We've learned that addicts are the master manipulators, and they know exactly how to work the family and how to tell everybody what they want to hear and get us all discombobulated so we're not talking to each other. And that's exactly what happened, and the effect on the family is awful. So we knew that Kyle had to go to rehab, or we also knew without uncertainty that he was going to die. But we've learned that they have to want their recovery. They have to want to go to rehab. As a parent, every night before I went to bed, I would check his room and make sure he was breathing. And every morning when I woke up, I would pray when I opened the door that he was breathing. And no parent should ever have to deal with this. Once Kyle finished the 30-day program, my husband and I decided as a family that we were not going to allow Kyle to come home. That was a really difficult decision. He had never lived on his own, but we realized the chaos that our family had been involved in and knew that we just needed more time to heal, especially his brother Kevin, who was an unwilling part of all of this. So we told Kyle he couldn't come home. He had a lot of relapses. I'll let him go into that. But we were thankful that he found his way through it all. We never gave up hope. You can't give up hope.
My name is Kyle Boomhauer. I'm a recovering heroin addict. And it's a privilege and an honor to be here tonight, because events like this are so important, and they're so important for two main reasons, right? The first one is that there's still such a stigma and a misconception about what addiction really is and what it looks like. When I was growing up, through middle school and high school, if you would ask me to picture a drug addict, it would have been, a bum under a bridge or on Skid Row, in like a trench coat with no teeth, looked like they were dying, just that stereotypical image of what you think a drug addict is. But that couldn't be further from the truth, right? I know I've had, the opportunity to meet a lot of recovering drug addicts, and I know people as young as 12 years old who got addicted to heroin and people as old as 75. I know doctors, lawyers, teachers, students, police officers, just about every domain of life this can touch. Nobody's exempt from addiction. And that's what was so surprising to me, because I grew up in Paramus, I grew up with a good suburban upbringing, and I had no real trauma in my life. I had two parents who loved me and provided for me. I was always a roof over my head. There was always food on the table. And I did really well in school, and I did really well in sports, and I had a big group of friends. And I couldn't imagine somebody like me becoming a drug addict. That just, I couldn't fathom that. So it's important to recognize that, like it's been said time and time again tonight, that nobody is exempt from this, that it can touch anybody's life. And the second reason that this is so important is because, like I just said, it can touch anybody's life, right? And the only way that you're going to be able to help is if you have an understanding of what addiction is and what it looks like and the way that it affects people. It's the only way that you're going to be able to help when it does touch your life. And so I think I can be of best service tonight in explaining the psychology, the mentality, just the reality of what it's like to be addicted to drugs like heroin, right? I started drinking and getting high when I was 14 years old. And it wasn't, it was at a normal, it was just like a party, like a middle school party that we were at, and somebody was passing around alcohol, and I was curious. And I had been through probably like 5 or 6 years of drug and alcohol prevention, education and training at this point. We were introduced to the DARE program in 5th grade, and you hear all about like, if you try cocaine, you're gonna die, and all of these crazy things. And so at this point, I knew full well that it was a risk. But that being said, I suffered from this idea that it's never gonna be me. This could never be me. And so I drank, and I started getting high. And alcohol and drugs had a different effect on me than they have on normal people, right? Because growing up, despite being this normal kid and succeeding in school and thriving in sports and having this big group of friends, it just felt like there was always this hole inside of me, right? That there was something inherently wrong with me, like I just didn't fit in anywhere. And so I would gravitate towards anything that made me feel good to just get out of my own head for like 5 minutes. And so initially when you're growing up, it's things like, you'll throw yourself into school, or you'll throw yourself into sports or relationships or music or whatever it is. But when I took that first drink and when I got high for the first time, it was like a revelatory experience for me. Is that if there's somebody in your life, and it could be friend, family member, somebody like about through somebody, whatever, there's ways that people can get out, right? So speak to your police officers, or speak to your medical professionals, or speak to people that work in recovery facilities. Because the truth is that just like the fact that addiction, nobody's exempt from addiction, no drug addict is exempt from recovery. So this is possible for any single one of them, but you just gotta want it. So again, I'm really grateful to be here tonight for this opportunity to speak, and thank you.
I've been working with the Prosecutor's Drug Rehab Center for over 20 years, and I've only gotten directly involved in it. Well, I've really been pushing it for the last 3 because of the exponential runs. Would you come? And I've listened to all like 30 or 40 things people can do. But in many of the programs that you've given and I've attended, Gail Cole's speech, Gail Cole was the woman from Allendale who lost her son to the opioid addiction. It really hit home with me. Would you talk about this issue of everybody being afraid to say something to somebody or to talk to a friend that they think their kids might be having a problem. Gail Cole in her speech, which I have on my councilman page, and I can bring it up to the front again, made it very clear that at the funeral and after the funeral, so many people came up and said, I had seen what was going on, and I just didn't want to tell you. And that's a big issue.
As the prosecutor said before, if you see something, say something. If it's your neighbor, if it's your friend, speak to them. Speak to their parents. Speak to their priest. You can call us. You can call a counselor. Speak to somebody. You know what? Everybody's afraid. It's like, oh, if I tell my neighbor that their child, I think they have a drug problem, my neighbor's going to be mad at me and never speak to me again. You know what? Your neighbor might be mad at you that day, but 6 months later they may come back and thank you. You have to start somewhere, and ignoring the problem and looking the other way is never an answer.
I mean, it's exactly that. It's what I said at the end of my remarks. I mean, we are hyper vigilant about so many different types of crimes, about terrorism, seeing something and saying something. We lost 65,000 people last year, right, to drug overdoses, the majority of which were heroin and opioid related. That probably far exceeds terrorism-related deaths in the United States, probably in the history of the country.
It far exceeds the automobile deaths,
Yeah.
like 45,000.
Why aren't we taking this as seriously? You know, we are, we've pivoted as a law enforcement agency completely, 180 degrees. And we have tremendous buy-in from all of our 70-plus police chiefs in this county. We are making it easy for families, family members to come in and turn in drugs or paraphernalia without fear of prosecution. We are making recovery resources available at police stations. We are making recovery resources available at our offices. We are, we realize that we're not going to lock up this disease. I mean, that's a given. So there shouldn't be a fear that someone's going to get arrested, because I think the overwhelming consensus among county law enforcement, certainly our office, and we get the final say on what gets prosecuted and not, is that we want to get these folks into treatment because that's where they belong.
So, this is a disease and it needs treatment. I felt so much stigma and shame when I found out that he had an addiction problem. And I didn't even tell my family. My own sister didn't know until she got a call from my father that her godson was dead. After, though, I did not feel that. We had about 1,000 people come to his funeral, and one person said, out of all the families I know, yours is the last place for this to happen to. So this does not discriminate. It doesn't care what town you're from. It doesn't care if you're a good mother. I taught them to bake the cookies. I did everything with my boys. There is stigma and shame. You have to end that. I think one of the things that the chief was talking about, and I think somebody else, is that if you think there's a problem, there is probably definitely a problem. People ask me if there were warning signs. There were incidences. There were things that I would chalk up to regular behavior. Looking back at them now in total, there were a lot of different things, and I'm sure, question and answer later, people can, I can address that. But if you know somebody who has a problem, there are a lot of parents that say, well, I'm mad at her because she said my kid's using drugs. Well, a lot of my son's friends feel really guilty because they knew that something wasn't right, but they didn't know what, and they didn't say anything. And when they stood in that funeral home and looked at their best friend in that coffin, they just couldn't, they just could not understand how that happened. So I urge you to continue to educate yourself. Pretty much a common theme among all the parents that I have met in my bereavement group is that they had anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and a lack of coping skills. And I hope that's something the schools are addressing, but that's really important. I think, Brendan, that anxiety, heroin's a lonely drug. You do it by yourself, and you do it because it makes you feel nothing. And when you have that anxiety, you have that low self-esteem, that pain is so deep, you don't want to feel that. So you do these drugs by yourself. Most kids die in their bedroom, alone. And, You have to get your kids help. Mental illness goes hand in hand with addiction, and I think you have to address it. It's okay, and our kids have to learn how to handle what is being thrown at them. We all want to be great parents and solve everyone's problems, but I think that we really need to help our kids learn how to cope. Thank you.